The mortar struck the pestle with a sound like breaking bones, and Naomi's hands trembled not from the cold Kentucky morning, but from the weight of what she was about to do. In the pre-dawn darkness of the kitchen house, her breath rose in pale ghosts as she ground the nightshade roots into powder fine as flour, deadly as the cotton fields that had stolen 43 years of her life. The poison released no scent, gave no warning, perfect as the silence before a scream. Her fingers, scarred from decades of labor, worked with the precision of a pianist playing a funeral dirge, each movement rehearsed 100 times in her mind since the day they took Mercy. Outside, frost still clung to the windows like the cold fingers of the dead, and somewhere in that darkness, she heard them. Footsteps on gravel, heavy and deliberate. The overseer's boots announcing his approach. Like thunder before lightning, Josiah Whitmore never slept past 4 even on Easter Sunday. The Lord's resurrection meant nothing to a man who believed himself already divine, already risen above those he ground beneath his heel. Naomi's hands moved faster now, scraping the deadly powder into a small cloth pouch, her heart hammering against her ribs like something caged and wild. The footsteps grew closer and she could hear his wheeze, the rattle in his chest from too much tobacco and whiskey, the same wheeze she'd heard the night he'd dragged Mercy from their cabin, the child's scream swallowed by the indifferent darkness of Bourbon County. With movements swift as prayer, Naomi shoved the poison beneath the flour sacks, grabbed the legitimate mortar filled with harmless herbs for the Easter lamb, and began grinding just as the door exploded open, bringing with it the stench of unwashed flesh and cruelty. "You're up early, Naomi," Whitmore said, his bulk filling the doorway like a blood clot in an artery. His eyes, pig-small and mean, scanned the kitchen with the suspicion of a man who knew he was hated, but believed fear would keep him safe. Judge wants everything perfect for his guests, 8 of the finest families in Kentucky coming to feast. He stepped closer, and Naomi kept her eyes down, grinding the rosemary and thyme with steady hands, while beneath the flour sacks lay enough poison to kill everyone in the county. "You hear me, woman?" "Yes, Master Whitmore," she said, her voice as carefully controlled as her hands. "Everything will be perfect." And in those words lay a promise he was too stupid to understand, a prophecy written in nightshade and hemlock, sealed with the tears of a mother who had nothing left to lose. If you're enjoying this dark tale of revenge, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more macabre stories from history. The kitchen filled with the sounds of preparation, as the sun began its climb over the hills of Bourbon County, painting the world in shades of blood and gold. Other enslaved people arrived in silence. Martha with her arms already aching from kneading bread, young Thomas to haul water from the well, and old Samuel, whose eyes held the weight of 70 winters and seemed to see through everything, including Naomi's carefully blank expression. He paused beside her, his gnarled hand resting briefly on the table where she worked, and she felt him watching as she seasoned the lamb with herbs that weren't quite what they seemed. "Strange weather for Easter," old Samuel said quietly, his voice like wind through dead leaves. "A storm is coming, I reckon. Can smell it in the air." His eyes met hers for just a moment, and in them she saw knowledge, or perhaps just suspicion. But either way, he said nothing more, shuffling away to polish the silver that would gleam on the table where death would feast. The Bellwether Plantation, squatted on the land like a bloated tick, 3 stories of imported limestone and local suffering, its windows dark as bruises against the pale morning sky. Inside, the mansion groaned with the weight of its own evil. Every board soaked in misery, every nail driven by enslaved hands, every room a monument to Judge Cornelius Bellwether's conviction that some men were born to own others. The portraits, lining the main hall, watched with oil-painted eyes. 5 generations of Bellwethers who'd built their fortune on backs that bent and broke in the tobacco fields, stretching endlessly beyond the windows. This morning those fields were quiet, but only because even the overseer's assistants were preparing for the feast, polishing boots and pressing the judge's finest coat, the one with buttons made from real gold, paid for with the sale of human beings. Naomi moved through the mansion like a ghost carrying linens and china, her presence as unremarkable as furniture to those who lived within these walls. In the dining room, she spread the white tablecloth across the mahogany table that could seat 20, though today only 8 would dine, 8 masters who would share more than Easter dinner, more than stories of profit and loss. They would share a faith that had been growing in the woods of Kentucky for months, in the places where Naomi gathered her bitter herbs under cover of darkness, learning from the old African woman who died last winter, taking her knowledge of plants that could kill as surely as a bullet, but left no trace except foam on blue lips and terror in dying eyes. Judge Bellwether descended the stairs at 7, his heavy frame making each step creak like a gallows. At away, 63, he remained vigorous in his cruelty, his face carved from privilege and casual evil, the kind of man who could sell a child before breakfast and still say grace over his eggs. "Naomi," he barked, though she was already moving toward him. "My guests begin arriving at noon. I want everything perfect, the lamb especially. It's Reverend Pike's favorite, and I won't have him thinking we've declined in our hospitality." "Yes, Master Bellwether," she replied, her eyes properly downcast, playing the role she'd perfected over decades, the loyal house slave, trusted enough to prepare their food, broken enough never to resist. If he'd looked closer, he might have seen the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers clenched slightly at her sides, but men like Cornelius Bellwether never really looked at their property. They saw function, not form, utility, not humanity. He'd signed the papers selling mercy without ever looking up from his ledger, just another transaction, another deposit in the bank of suffering that had made him rich. The morning crawled forward, like a wounded animal, and with each passing hour the mansion transformed. Delilah, Naomi's surviving daughter, polished the crystal until it caught the light like captured tears. At 16, she moved with the grace Naomi had once possessed, before the years had bent her spine and hardened her heart. Watching Delilah work, Naomi felt the poison's weight beneath the flour sacks like a promise. This child would not be sold, would not disappear into the vast cruelty of Mississippi or Louisiana, or any of the other states where enslaved people vanished like smoke. Today would change everything, though Delilah didn't know it yet, humming softly as she arranged flowers in vases, Easter lilies white as burial shrouds. The sounds from the fields had started again. Not the crack of whips, not exactly, but the shuffle of feet, the low murmur of voices as field hands were roused for display. Judge Bellwether liked his guests to see his property, liked to walk them through the quarters like a man showing prize cattle, pointing out the strongest backs, the most fertile women, the children who showed promise of growing into profitable adults. Even Easter Sunday was not sacred enough to stop commerce, not when there were deals to be struck over lamb and wine. In the kitchen, Naomi began the final preparations. The lamb sat in its pan, innocent as its namesake, waiting for the special seasoning she'd prepared. Her hands no longer trembled as she retrieved the poison from its hiding place, mixing it carefully with salt and herbs, creating a rub that would penetrate deep into the meat, ensuring every bite carried death within it. She thought of Mercy. As she worked, 11 years old, sold south because Judge Bellwether needed funds for a new thoroughbred horse. She thought of Solomon, her husband, dead these 15 years, hanged from a tree for the crime of teaching himself to read. She thought of all the others, the families torn apart, the backs scarred beyond recognition, the women who came back from the master's bedroom with dead eyes and swelling bellies. The poison disappeared into the meat like secrets into silence, and Naomi felt a strange peace settle over her. Outside, she could hear carriages beginning to arrive, wheels crunching on the gravel drive, voices raised in greeting, the masters gathering for their feast. Let them come, she thought. Let them gather in their finery and their righteousness, their talk of property rights and Christian duty. Let them sit at that table and break bread together, never knowing that the woman they'd never really seen, whose humanity they'd never acknowledged, had finally decided to be seen in the only way that mattered. Through the death that would foam on their lips, the convulsions that would rack their bodies, the terror that would fill their eyes as they realized that all their power, all their wealth, all their certainty of superiority meant nothing against a mother's grief transformed into rage. The sun climbed higher over Bourbon County, and in the kitchen of the Bellwether Plantation, Death wore the face of a woman grinding herbs, her expression as calm as Easter morning, as final as the grave. The first carriage emerged from the morning, fog like a hearse from a nightmare, its black lacquer gleaming with moisture, wheels crushing the gravel with the weight of inherited cruelty. From her position at the window of the second floor, where she'd been sent to ensure the guest rooms were prepared, Naomi watched Ezekiel Harrow of Madison County descend from his transport with the careful movements of a man who trusted nothing and no one, not even the ground beneath his feet. His reputation preceded him like the stench of death. The breaker of bucks, they called him. A man who specialized in destroying the spirit of rebellious enslaved men through methods that would make even the devil weep. His face, angular and sharp as a hatchet, turned toward the mansion, and for a moment Naomi felt his gaze pass over her window like the shadow of a carrion bird. She stepped back, her hand unconsciously moving to her chest where her heart beat with the steady rhythm of a war drum. Below, Judge Bellwether emerged to greet his guest, their handshake the meeting of two predators recognizing each other's territory. "Ezekiel, by God, you've made good time from Madison County. The roads must be improving." Bellwether's voice carried up through the thin glass, jovial and false as a politician's promise. Harrow's response was lost in the wind, but his laugh, sharp and mirthless, cut through the morning air like a scythe through wheat. Behind him, his personal servant, a young man named Gabriel with eyes that never lifted from the ground, began unloading luggage, his movements mechanical, broken, the perfect advertisement for his master's methods. Don't forget to leave a comment below telling us what you think of this twisted Easter feast, and subscribe if you haven't already. The second carriage arrived before the dust from the first had settled, this one pristine white like a sepulchre, carrying the widow Constance Blackwood from Fayette County. She descended with the aid of her infamous silver-tipped cane, the one whispered about in slave quarters across 3 counties, silver mined by enslaved hands, forged into an instrument of punishment that had left scars on countless backs, legs, and faces. At 47, she maintained the severe beauty of a woman who'd never smiled from joy, only from satisfaction at others' suffering. Her husband had died 5 years ago under mysterious circumstances. Some said poison, though no one dared investigate too closely, leaving her sole ownership of 800 acres and 200 souls. She wore mourning black still, not from grief but because it suited her nature, and as she glided toward the mansion, Naomi noticed how even Judge Bellwether's dog shrank away from her approach. "Constance, my dear," Bellwether called out, his voice taking on an unctuous quality reserved for wealthy widows. "You're looking splendid as always, Cornelius," she replied, her voice like ice cracking on a frozen pond. "I trust the accommodations will be better than last year. That mattress was absolutely medieval." She tapped her cane against the ground with each step, a metallic heartbeat that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the house. Her personal maid, a girl of no more than 14 named Flora, struggled behind her with hat boxes and bags, her left eye still swollen from some recent correction. The morning grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, burning off the fog to reveal the full expanse of the Bellwether estate. Thousands of acres of tobacco stretching to the horizon, like a green sea of profit and pain. The third and fourth carriages arrived together, carrying the Cross brothers from Clark County, Jeremiah and Jebediah, identical in their cruelty as they were in their appearance. 52 years old, both widowers, their wives had died within months of each other, exhausted by bearing children and brutality in equal measure. They ran their plantation with military precision, having served together in the War of 1812 and never quite leaving the battlefield behind. They dressed identically, black coats, gray trousers, matching gold watch chains across their vests, and moved with the synchronized precision of practiced predators. "The Cross brothers," Bellwether boomed, striding forward with arms outstretched. "Together as always." "Separated at birth, joined at the profit margin," Jeremiah said, the joke worn smooth from years of repetition. "Speaking of profit," Jebediah added, his eyes already scanning the grounds with the calculating gaze of a man perpetually taking inventory. "I hear you've acquired some new stock from the Carolinas." Indeed. We'll tour the quarters after dinner." I think you'll be impressed with the investment potential. Naomi descended the servants' stairs, her arms full of fresh linens, passing through the main hall just as the fifth guest arrived. Thaddeus Bellwether, the judge's only surviving son, had been away at Princeton, returning with what he called modern ideas about plantation management. Ideas that involved ledgers and logarithms, treating human beings like mathematical equations, to be solved for maximum efficiency. At 28, he had his father's cruel mouth but his dead mother's intelligent eyes, a combination that made him more dangerous than the judge because he could rationalize any atrocity with education's polished vocabulary. He embraced his father briefly, the gesture perfunctory as a handshake, then immediately began discussing his new theories on optimal labor distribution and mortality cost-benefit analysis. "Father, I've been corresponding with some plantation owners in Cuba," Thaddeus said, his voice carrying the insufferable confidence of youth convinced of its own brilliance. "They've developed fascinating methods for increasing productivity while minimizing food costs. I've brought charts." "Of course you have," the elder Bellwether replied, pride and irritation warring in his voice. "We'll review them after dinner." The sixth arrival brought Reverend Mordecai Pike, his carriage modest compared to the others but his presence no less oppressive. He emerged clutching his Bible like a weapon, which in his hands it essentially was, every verse twisted to justify slavery, every parable perverted to support the profitable suffering of others. His face, round and red as a ham, gleamed with the sweat of a man who consumed more than he preached against. And his voice, trained by years of fire and brimstone sermons, could make even a greeting sound like a condemnation. He traveled alone, having declared servants too tempting to the weakness of the flesh. Though everyone knew about his midnight visits to the quarters, always to minister to the souls of young women who emerged from these sessions with dead eyes and coins they dared not spend. "Judge Bellwether," Pike called out, his voice rolling across the grounds like thunder. "I trust you've prepared for both our physical and spiritual nourishment today. Easter demands both." "Indeed, Reverend. Naomi has prepared your favorite, lamb, as requested." "Ah, the Paschal lamb. How appropriate." Pike's laugh was wet and unpleasant. "Though I dare say our version will be more palatable than the original, eh?" He chuckled at his own blasphemy, comfortable in his corruption of everything sacred. The seventh guest's arrival was announced by the barking of dogs and the crack of a whip. Prudence Ashford, at 73, the oldest and perhaps cruelest of them all, had brought her own driver, having trust issues that extended even to transportation. She descended from her carriage with surprising agility for her age, her face a map of wrinkles that resembled nothing so much as cracks in dried mud, each line earned through decades of inflicting misery. She was famous or infamous for having once had an enslaved woman's tongue cut out for sass, displaying it in a jar of alcohol in her parlor as a warning to others. Her dress, though expensive, belonged to a fashion 30 years past, as if she'd stopped acknowledging time's passage the moment she'd accumulated enough wealth to ignore it. "Prudence," Bellwether said, his voice taking on the careful tone reserved for unpredictable animals. "You're looking well. Don't lie, Cornelius. I look like death warmed over and we both know it. But I'll outlive you all out of pure spite." She cackled, the sound like branches breaking. "Now where's that famous wine cellar of yours? If I'm going to pretend to enjoy Pike's sermonizing, I'll need fortification." As the masters gathered in the parlor, Naomi moved among them like a shadow, serving drinks from a silver tray that reflected their faces in distortion. Appropriate, she thought, as they were already distorted, humanity twisted into something, monstrous by the absolute power they wielded. She studied each of them with the careful attention of a general surveying a battlefield. Ezekiel preferred bourbon, 2 fingers neat. The widow Blackwood took sherry, but only if served in crystal. The Cross brothers drank identical scotches, synchronized even in their sipping. Thaddeus favored port, pretentious as his education. Pike claimed temperance but accepted wine for medicinal purposes. Prudence demanded gin, straight, no pretense of propriety. Old Samuel stood in the corner, ostensibly polishing a mirror but watching everything with those ancient eyes that seemed to see through time itself. When Naomi passed close to him, he whispered, barely audible, "Storm's getting closer." She didn't respond, couldn't respond, but felt the weight of his knowledge like a hand on her shoulder. He knew something, perhaps not the specifics, but the shape of it, the way animals know earthquakes are coming before the ground starts shaking. Delilah entered carrying a tray of appetizers, her grace drawing the attention of Thaddeus, whose eyes followed her with an interest that made Naomi's blood turn to ice water. She'd seen that look before, the calculating gaze of a master considering property, evaluating potential uses. It was the same look Judge Bellwether had worn the day before he'd sold Mercy. Naomi's resolve, already granite hard, transformed into something harder still. Diamond, perhaps, or whatever substance forms in the heart of a mother who is lost. Everything except the ability to prevent losing more. The conversation in the parlor turned, as it always did, to business. The business of buying and selling human beings with the casual ease of men discussing livestock or lumber. "I've got a buck who can pick 300 pounds of cotton in a day," Ezekiel boasted, swirling his bourbon. "Course took some breaking to get him there. Amazing what the proper motivation can accomplish." "Motivation?" Constance laughed. "The sound like glass breaking. Is that what we're calling it now? How delightfully euphemistic." "The Lord provides us with the tools to shepherd our flock," Pike interjected, his voice unctuous with false piety. "The rod and the staff, as the psalm says." "Your rod seems to comfort quite a few of the younger ewes," Prudence observed dryly, causing Pike to redden but not deny. The Cross brothers spoke in their unnerving way of finishing each other's sentences. "We've found that separating families," Jeremiah began, "increases productivity significantly," Jebediah finished. "The threat of sale is more effective than any whip." Naomi's hands remained steady as she refilled their glasses, but inside she felt something breaking and reforming, like ice cracking on a river to reveal the dark water flowing beneath. Each word they spoke was another confirmation, another judgment, another signature on their death warrants. They sat in their fine clothes in this fine house, built on a foundation of bones and watered with blood, and felt nothing but satisfaction at their own cleverness. They would learn soon enough that cleverness was not the sole province of those who'd been educated at Princeton or Yale. Sometimes it grew wild in the quarters, nurtured by necessity and fertilized with grief. "Gentlemen and ladies," Judge Bellwether announced, rising from his chair, his shadow falling across the floor like a portent. "Shall we adjourn to the dining room? I believe our Easter feast awaits." They rose as one, a procession of the damned though they didn't know it yet, moving toward the dining room where the table was set with the finest china, the whitest linens, the most gleaming silver, all of it polished by hands they never noticed, never acknowledged as human. Naomi followed behind them, and for just a moment allowed herself a small, secret smile. The lamb was resting, its meat tender and perfectly seasoned, waiting to be carved and served. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as it should be for the last meal of 8 masters who had forgotten, if they ever knew, that even the meekest lamb, when cornered, when robbed of everything, could become something else entirely, could become the wolf that devours the shepherd. The dining room doors closed behind them with a sound like the sealing of a tomb. The dining room of the Bellwether mansion had witnessed countless meals over, its 40-year history, but none quite like this Easter feast, though the 8 masters seated around the mahogany table had no inkling that this Sunday's resurrection would be followed so swiftly by their own damnation. The crystal chandelier, imported from Austria at the cost of 3 human beings sold to pay for it, cast dancing shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like the souls of the tormented, though perhaps that was just Naomi's imagination as she entered bearing the soup course, her face a mask of servile calm that betrayed nothing of the deadly calculation beneath. "Turtle soup," Judge Bellwether announced proudly as Naomi ladled the rich brown liquid into bowls so fine they were nearly translucent. "Recipe from New Orleans. Cost me a fortune to get my cook trained proper." He spoke of Naomi as if she weren't, standing directly beside him, as if she were no more animate than the ladle in her hand. and she let his words wash over her like water over stone, eroding nothing of her purpose. The soup was innocent. She needed them hungry, needed them eager, for the main course needed their appetites sharp as the knife that would soon carve the lamb. She moved around the table with practiced invisibility, noting how Ezekiel Harrow slurped noisily, how the widow Blackwood dabbed her lips with her napkin after each delicate sip, how the Cross brothers ate in perfect synchronization, how Thaddeus barely touched his bowl, too busy expounding on his theories of scientific management to notice food, how Reverend Pike blessed his soup with one hand while his other crept toward Delilah when she leaned close to pour his wine, how Prudence Ashford complained that the soup was too hot, then too cold, then too salty, though she emptied her bowl, nonetheless. "This reminds me," Pike said, his voice carrying that particular tone that preceded one of his theological justifications for cruelty, "of the miracle of the loaves and fishes. The Lord provides abundance to those who follow his plan. And what is slavery but part of his divine organization? The children of Ham, marked for servitude, feeding the children of Japheth with their labor. Biblical, really." "Fascinating interpretation, Reverend," Thaddeus said with barely concealed mockery. "Though I prefer to think of it in terms of natural selection, the superior race naturally rising to positions of authority, the inferior finding their proper place in the order of things. Darwin would understand perfectly." "Darwin's a heretic," Pike sputtered, soup droplets flying from his lips. "Perhaps," Thaddeus smiled, "but a useful one." The conversation continued in this vein, philosophy and theology twisted into shapes that would justify any horror, any cruelty, any sin against humanity, all while they sat beneath a painting of the Last Supper, Christ and his disciples rendered in oils looking down on this parody of communion. Naomi cleared the soup bowls, her movements fluid as water, each gesture practiced and precise. In the kitchen she found old Samuel waiting, his eyes heavy with unspoken knowledge. "The lamb ready?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was asking about more than meat. "Perfect," Naomi replied, lifting the heavy platter where the lamb rested in its bed of roasted vegetables, the meat glistening with juices that carried more than flavor. The nightshade, hemlock, and oleander had been worked into the flesh with the same care she'd once used to swaddle her babies, back when she'd had babies to swaddle, back when she'd believed that love might be enough to protect them from a world built on their destruction. She carried the platter into the dining room like a priestess bearing an offering, which in a way she was, an offering to justice, to revenge, to the angry ghosts of all who died under these masters' hands. The room erupted in appreciation at the sight of the lamb, perfectly bronzed, aromatic with herbs that masked other more sinister additions. Judge Bellwether stood to carve, his thick hands steady on the knife, the blade sliding through meat, with the ease of long practice. He'd carved up families with the same casual precision, Naomi thought, watching him serve generous portions to each guest. "Magnificent," exclaimed Ezekiel, already cutting into his portion. "The herbs, what's that flavor, rosemary?" "Among other things," Naomi said quietly, the only word she'd spoken in their presence all day. They didn't notice the strangeness of her speaking unbidden. They were already lost in their gluttony, their celebration of another successful year, of profit wrung from human misery. The widow Blackwood took delicate bites, her silver-tipped cane resting against her chair like a sleeping serpent. "Surprisingly competent," she admitted, which was the closest to a compliment she'd ever given anyone, much less an enslaved person. "Though I still maintain the servants at Blackwood Manor are superior." "Everything's a competition with you, Constance," Prudence cackled, sawing at her meat with the vigor of someone who'd spent 73 years consuming everything in her path. "Can't even enjoy a meal without making it about superiority." "Superiority is not something one makes," Constance replied coldly. "It simply is, like the natural order itself." The Cross brothers ate with mechanical precision, cutting their meat into identical portions, chewing the same number of times, swallowing in unison. It might have been comical if these weren't men who'd perfected the industrialization of human suffering, turning their plantation into a factory that processed, Souls into profit with assembly line efficiency. Excellent texture, Jeremiah noted. Superb seasoning, Jebediah added. We should inquire about purchasing this cook. They spoke of buying Naomi while she stood right there, refilling their wine glasses with hands that wanted to tremble. But didn't. Wouldn't, not now when she was so close to her purpose. She watched them eat, each bite bringing them closer to their fate, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Power. For the first time in her life, she held power over them, though they didn't know it yet. Reverend Pike was already on his second helping, gravy dripping down his chin as he spoke through mouthfuls of meat. The Paschal Lamb, he proclaimed, reminds us of sacrifice, of blood that saves. The irony of his words would have been amusing if Naomi had any capacity for amusement left. This lamb would indeed involve sacrifice and blood, though not in the way Pike imagined. Thaddeus picked at his food more thoughtfully, his educated palate detecting something perhaps, though not enough to stop eating. Father, this is exceptional. What did you say was in the seasoning? Family secret, Judge Bellwether laughed, the sound booming across the table. Though I suppose it'll die with Naomi here. Can't have her teaching others and diminishing our advantage. He spoke of her death as casually as he might discuss the weather, not knowing how prophetic his words were, though not in the way he imagined. The vegetables disappeared, the bread was demolished, and the lamb was devoured with a near enthusiasm that would have been gratifying if Naomi had been seeking their approval rather than their annihilation. She moved between kitchen and dining room, bringing more wine, more bread, watching their faces for the first signs. It would be subtle at first, a flush that could be attributed to wine, a looseness that might be the good food and company. The poison was elegant in its patience, designed to let them finish their meal, to let them feel satisfied and safe before it began its true work. A toast. Judge Bellwether raised his glass, face red with wine and gluttony. To another profitable, yar, to the natural order that places us here at this table and them in their proper places, to the confederacy of commerce that binds us all in mutual benefit. They raised their glasses, crystal ringing against crystal with a sound like funeral bells, and drank deeply. Naomi watched from her position by the wall, memorizing this moment. These 8 faces flushed with wine and certainty, these 16 hands that had signed bills of sale and wielded whips, these 8 mouths that had pronounced sentences of separation and death, now full of poisoned lamb and empty promises to a god they'd remade in their own cruel image. Marvelous. Feast, Cornelius, Prudence declared, dabbing at her lips with her napkin. Though I confess I'm feeling rather warm. Perhaps we could retire to the parlor for brandy? Capital idea, agreed Pike, though Naomi noticed he was sweating more than usual, his red face now approaching purple. I've prepared a special Easter sermon I'd like to share. The relationship between Christ's suffering and the beneficial suffering of the servant class. Most illuminating. They rose from the table, some more steadily than others. Ezekiel Harrow gripped the back of his chair, for a moment blinking hard. Strong wine, he muttered. Stronger than usual, one of the Cross brothers agreed, though which one was becoming difficult to tell as the poison began its subtle work, making everything slightly uncertain, slightly wrong. The widow Blackwood's. Cane scraped against the floor as she stood, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet that seemed to fall over the room. I feel, she began, then stopped, her usual certainty deserting her. It's the heat, Thaddeus suggested, though the room wasn't particularly warm. Perhaps we should open some windows. They moved toward the parlor in a procession less steady than their arrival, and Naomi began clearing the table, her task nearly complete. The poison was in them now, working its way through their bloodstreams like all the prayers of all the people they'd killed, sold, tortured, and broken. It would take time, another hour perhaps, before they understood what was happening. For now they would attribute their discomfort to overindulgence, to wine, to the natural consequences of gluttony, rather than the unnatural consequences of justice. Old Samuel appeared in the doorway, his ancient face unreadable. Need help clearing, Naomi? No, she said softly, stacking the plates that had held death disguised as dinner. "I've got everything under control." He looked at her for a long moment, then at the remains of the lamb, the bones picked clean, the platter empty, save for congealing grease and the ghost of herbs that were never meant for seasoning. "Storm's here," he said finally, and left her alone with the evidence of her careful crime. From the parlor came the sound of Pike beginning his sermon, his voice already slightly slurred, though he probably attributed it to the wine. Naomi listened while she worked, hearing him twist scripture into shapes that justified their system, never knowing he was already dying, that each word brought him closer to a judgment no amount of theological gymnastics could avoid. The widow, Blackwood's cane tapped irregularly now, its rhythm disrupted. The Cross brothers' synchronized movements were beginning to fall out of step. Ezekiel's loud voice was softer, uncertain. Prudence's complaints had turned to mumbles. Thaddeus's education couldn't help him identify what was wrong. And Judge Bellwether, master of this domain, owner of hundreds of human beings, sat in his favorite chair, growing ever more uncomfortable in skin that had always fit him perfectly until now. The dining room was clean, the evidence consumed, the table reset for a meal that would never come. Naomi stood in the doorway watching the shadows dance in the light of the dying afternoon sun and waited. The hardest part was over. Now came the watching, the witnessing, the careful observation of justice taking its course. She thought of Mercy, sold away and gone forever. She thought of Solomon, hanging from that tree. She thought of all the others, whose names she carried like prayers, and she felt their presence in the room, gathering like the shadows, waiting to witness what came next. The lamb had been served. The feast had been consumed. Now came the reckoning, slow and certain as the setting sun that painted the dining room walls the color of blood. Judge Cornelius Bellwether was the first to understand that something was terribly wrong, though the knowledge came to him not as revelation but as revolution, his body revolting against him with the same sudden violence he'd visited upon others for 6 decades. The brandy glass slipped from his fingers, crystal shattering against the parlor's oak floor in a spray of amber and light, and he tried to stand but found his legs had become strangers to him, rebellious subjects refusing his commands. His face, already red from wine and gluttony, deepened to purple, then to something beyond purple, a color that belonged in nightmares rather than nature. And when he opened his mouth to speak, to command, to demand help, only a wet gurgle emerged. Foam, beginning to form at the corners of his lips like the sea's last kiss to a drowning man. "Cornelius?" Ezekiel Harrow's voice came from very far away, though he sat merely across the room. But Ezekiel had his own troubles now, his famous strength deserting him like slaves fleeing north, his muscles that had broken so many others now, breaking themselves, twitching and spasming in rhythms that belonged to no dance ever conceived. He tried to rise, managed to get halfway vertical before crashing down, his weight that had been used to pin down struggling men now pinning him to the Turkish carpet, where he writhed like something newborn and dying simultaneously. Don't forget to leave a comment below telling us what you think of this twisted Easter feast, and subscribe if you haven't already. The widow Blackwood's silver-tipped cane clattered to the floor as her hands began to shake. Not the gentle tremor of age, but the violent palsy of muscles at war with themselves. What is... she managed before her throat closed. Not completely, not mercifully, but enough to turn words into wheezes, enough to make each breath a battle she was losing. Her eyes, usually cold as winter mornings, now blazed with the heat of understanding, the terrible knowledge that something inside her was wrong, fundamentally wrong, catastrophically wrong. She looked at Naomi, who stood in the doorway with Delilah behind her, both watching with expressions carved from stone, and in that moment Constance Blackwood knew. Her mouth opened and closed like a landed fish trying to form the word, you. But even that single syllable was beyond her now. The Cross brothers, who had lived their lives in perfect synchronization, found their deaths diverging in the cruelest way. Jeremiah fell first, his chair tipping backward as convulsion seized him, his head striking the floor with a sound like a melon dropped from height. Jebediah reached for his brother, their lifetime of coordination broken by poison that recognized no bonds, no connections, only the democracy of death that made all men equal in their ending. Jebediah's reach fell short as his own seizure began, and the brothers lay separated by mere feet that might as well have been miles, each dying alone despite their proximity, their matched gold watch chains catching the light as they thrashed, time running out in perfect unison at least. Reverend Mordecai Pike had been in the middle of his sermon, something about divine order and natural hierarchy, when his words transformed into glossolalia that no seminary had taught him. His tongue, which had twisted scripture to justify suffering, now twisted in his mouth like a separate creature trying to escape. The Bible fell from his hands, pages fluttering open to Exodus. "Let my people go," though no one noticed the irony except perhaps God himself. Pike dropped to his knees, not in prayer but in surrender to the democracy of poison that cared nothing for his collar, his calling, or his connections to the Almighty. Foam poured from his mouth like unholy baptism, and his eyes rolling back in his head saw whatever waits for men who've made merchandise of misery while wearing the cloth of Christ. Thaddeus Bellwether, young and strong and educated, fought, longest against the inevitable. His Princeton education had taught him about poisons, about symptoms, about the human body's responses to various toxins, and he knew exactly what was happening. Poisoned, he gasped, the word barely audible through his constricting throat. The food, the lamb. His analytical mind, even as it died, couldn't help but admire the elegance of it. The slow onset, the irreversibility once symptoms appeared, the choice of Easter dinner as delivery method. He crawled toward the door, not to escape. He knew that was impossible now. But toward Naomi, needing to know why, needing to understand what force could drive someone to this ultimate rebellion. Prudence Ashford, 73 years of surviving, everything the world could throw at her, found herself finally facing something she couldn't outlive through spite alone. She sat rigid in her chair, her body seizing and releasing in waves, her ancient face contorting into expressions that belonged in Hieronymus Bosch's visions of hell. But her eyes remained clear, remained focused, remained fixed on Naomi with a hatred so pure it could have powered cities. Even dying, even helpless, she tried to maintain the superiority that had defined her entire life, her mouth working to form curses, commands, threats, anything to reassert the power that was flowing out of her like blood from a severed artery. "Help us," Judge Bellwether managed to gasp, though whether he was addressing Naomi, God, or the universe itself was unclear. He had fallen from his chair and now crawled across the floor, his expensive suit soaking up the spilled brandy, his body leaving a trail of sweat and worse things. "Get help." Naomi stepped into the room then, Delilah still behind her, and her voice when she spoke was calm as a funeral hymn. "There is no help. Not from the quarters you've terrorized. Not from the God you've perverted. Not from the system you've built on our backs and bones." She moved among them like a dark angel. Not to comfort but to witness, to ensure they understood in their final moments that this was not random, not an accident, not a mistake. This was judgment. "You," Bellwether wheezed, reaching toward her, with a hand that had signed so many bills of sale it could probably write them in its sleep. "You served us. Loyally." "I served you, poisoned lamb," Naomi corrected, her voice steady as stone. "Just as you've served us poisoned lives for generations. Every bite you took was seasoned with nightshade grown in soil watered by our tears. Every swallow carried hemlock nurtured by our rage. Every morsel contained oleander fertilized by our grief." The widow Blackwood made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a death rattle. At this stage they sounded remarkably similar. Her silver-tipped cane lay just out of reach, that instrument of torture now as useless as the hands that had wielded it. She tried to speak, her mouth forming what looked like impossible, but possibility and impossibility had switched places tonight, the powerless becoming powerful, the servants becoming judges, the last becoming first in the most final way imaginable. "Ezekiel," Harrow, the breaker of men, found himself broken on the wheel of his own mortality. His great strength was now his enemy, his powerful body fighting the poison longer, making his suffering extended, elaborate, exquisite. He who had perfected the art of breaking spirits through prolonged agony now experienced the student becoming the master. Though Naomi had never sought his tutelage, had learned instead from the plants that grew wild in Kentucky woods, the knowledge, passed down in whispers from those who remembered African soil and African wisdom. Why? Thaddeus managed to ask, having crawled close enough to see Naomi's face clearly. His educated mind needed to understand, needed to categorize and analyze, even as it ceased to function. "You sold my daughter Mercy 3 days ago," Naomi said simply. 11 years old, sold to Mississippi to pay for your father's new horse. That was the last cruelty, the one that broke whatever kept me obedient. She looked at each of them in turn. But it wasn't just Mercy. It was all of them. Every child is sold away from their mother. Every husband separated from his wife. Every back is scarred by your whips. Every woman violated in your beds. Every man worked to death in your fields. Every prayer for justice that seemed to go unanswered. Until today. Reverend Pike tried to pray, his lips moving in familiar patterns, but the words wouldn't come. Perhaps there were no prayers for men who'd spent their lives on the wrong side of righteousness. No salvation for those who'd twisted salvation itself into a tool of oppression. His hands, which had held the Bible while preaching submission to slaves, now clutched at his throat as if he could manually force air through passages that were closing like the gates of heaven against him. The Cross brothers had managed to crawl toward each other, their synchronization returning in death if not in life. They reached for each other's hands, these men who'd separated so many families, now desperate for human connection in their final moments. Their fingers touched, briefly, before another wave of convulsions pulled them apart, and they died as they'd lived, together but alone, successful but empty, powerful but ultimately powerless against the democracy of death that made no distinction between master and slave. Old Samuel appeared in the doorway, his ancient face showing no surprise. At the scene before him, he looked at the dying masters, then at Naomi, then at young Delilah, who stood transfixed by the horror and justice of it all. "Others are coming from the quarters," he said quietly. They heard the screaming. And indeed, they had been screaming, though in their agony, they hadn't realized it. Screams that carried across the plantation, through the slave quarters into the fields where people stopped their Easter prayers to listen to sounds they'd never heard before. The sound of masters in agony, the sound of power dying, the sound of the world turning upside down if only for one night. Judge Bellwether made one final attempt to assert his authority, to be the master even in death. "You'll hang for this?" "Yes," Naomi agreed, her voice peaceful as a benediction. "But you'll be dead, and that's a trade I'm willing to make." More enslaved people appeared in the doorway, drawn by the impossible sound of their tormentors' torment. They stood watching, some in horror, some in satisfaction, some in simple shock at seeing those who'd seemed invincible reduced to writhing, foam-mouthed mortality. None moved to help, none called for aid. They simply witnessed as if this were a passion play they'd waited their whole lives to see performed. Prudence Ashford died first, perhaps from age, perhaps from spite turned inward, perhaps simply because even death wanted to shut her up. She went rigid, then limp, her eyes still open and staring at Naomi with an expression of outrage that would follow her into whatever afterlife awaited those who'd spent their earthly existence making hell for others. The others followed in their own time, each death unique in its details but identical in its inevitability. Ezekiel Harrow died breaking, his bones seeming to snap from the force of his convulsions. The widow Blackwood died in silence, her voice stolen as she'd stolen so many others' voices. The Cross brothers died within seconds of each other, their synchronization maintained to the very end. Reverend Pike died with his mouth open, mid-sermon or mid-scream, no one could tell which. Thaddeus died still trying to understand, his analytical mind wrestling with the problem until the very moment it ceased to function. And Judge Cornelius Bellwether, master of the plantation, owner of hundreds of souls, died last and worst, the poison seeming to save its cruelest work for him. He died seeing Naomi's face above him, calm and implacable as justice itself. He died knowing that his death would not be mourned by those he'd claimed to own. He died understanding in his final moments that ownership had always been an illusion, that power was temporary, that even masters could become victims of the violence they'd sown. The parlor fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock, counting out seconds in a world that had just changed fundamentally, irrevocably, impossibly. 8 bodies lay scattered across the floor like dolls discarded by a vengeful child. The Easter feast had ended. The passion play was complete, and Naomi stood among the dead, knowing that her own death would come soon, but feeling for the first time in 43 years, truly alive. The dying continued with the deliberate patience of torture perfected, as if the poison itself had learned cruelty from the masters it was killing, turning their own methods against them in a final, terrible poetry. The parlor had become a cathedral of suffering, its vaulted ceiling echoing with sounds that no human throat should make, while the portraits of previous Bellwether generations looked down upon the apocalypse of their line with oil-painted eyes that seemed, in the flickering candlelight, to weep or perhaps to laugh. Constance Blackwood's death was a masterwork of ironic justice, her body betraying her with the same systematic brutality she'd visited upon others for 30 years of widowhood. The poison attacked her nervous system with particular viciousness, sending signals of agony through pathways that had once carried her commands to strike, to whip, to wound. Her hands, those perfectly manicured instruments of torture, curled into claws that raked at her own throat, leaving red furrows in flesh that had never known violence until now. In her delirium she began to speak, not to those present but to phantoms only she could see. The ghosts of everyone she'd ever hurt, perhaps, gathered now to witness her ending. "Mother?" she gasped, her voice high and childlike, stripped of its usual Arctic authority. "Mother, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Please don't leave me in the dark." Her eyes, wide with terror, fixed on empty air, seeing something that made her wealthy, powerful, cruel face crumble into the expression of a frightened child. "I've been wicked, Mother. I've been so wicked. They screamed when I hurt them, just like you said they would. You said it would make me strong. But Mother, I think I'm dying, and I'm not strong at all." The confession poured from her lips between convulsions, a lifetime of sins spilling out like blood from a mortal wound. She spoke of her first act of cruelty at age 7, encouraged by a mother who taught her that kindness was weakness. She babbled about her husband's death, confirming what everyone had suspected: arsenic in his tea served by her own hand when he'd threatened to free their slaves in his will. She named names, dates, atrocities that even Naomi hadn't known about, her dying mind unable to stop the flow of truth that had been dammed up behind decades of calculated coldness. The Cross brothers' synchronized dying had become a grotesque ballet, their bodies moving in horrific harmony as the poison worked through their identical systems at identical rates. But now, in these final moments, their unity fractured in the most cruel way possible. Jeremiah's eyes cleared first, the delirium parting like curtains to reveal the full horror of his situation. He saw his brother beside him, saw the foam and blood, saw the faces of the enslaved people watching from the doorway, and understood with perfect clarity what had happened and what was coming. "Jebediah," he tried to say, but his brother was lost in his own dying, unable to hear or respond. For the first time in 52 years, Jeremiah was alone, truly alone, and the terror of that isolation was worse than the physical agony. He reached out, fingers grasping, but Jebediah was turned away, his own hands clutching at his chest where his heart was failing in stutters and stops. They had been born together, lived together, sinned together, and now they would die together, but apart, each locked in the solitary confinement of their own mortality. Jebediah's delirium took a different path, his mind retreating to their childhood in Virginia, before they'd inherited their first slave, before they'd learned that power could be pleasure. "Jeremy," he whispered, using the childhood nickname he hadn't spoken in 40 years. "Remember the summer we caught fireflies? Mother put them in a jar for us. They glowed so pretty before they died. Everything glows prettier before it dies, doesn't it? Even us, Jeremy. Even us. Thaddeus Bellwether, still crawling with the determination of youth that didn't yet believe, in its own ending had made it almost to Naomi's feet. His education, which he'd wielded like a weapon to justify greater efficiencies in human suffering, now became his curse as his mind catalogued each symptom, each stage of his deterioration. He knew exactly what the nightshade was doing to his nervous system, could visualize the hemlock paralyzing his muscles, understood how the oleander was disrupting his heart's rhythm. Knowledge became tormented as he experienced his death both subjectively and objectively, scientist and subject combined in one failing body. The children, he gasped, looking up at Naomi with eyes that had lost their casual cruelty and found something almost human in its place. You did this for the children, for all of them, Naomi confirmed. For every child who'll never be sold now because you won't be alive to sign the papers. For every mother who won't wake screaming their names. For every father who won't have to watch his babies disappear down the road like morning mist. Thaddeus's hand found something in his pocket, a small daguerreotype he always carried. With trembling fingers he pulled it out and Naomi saw it was a picture of a young woman, beautiful and sad-eyed. Sarah, he whispered. My wife. Died in childbirth last year. The baby too. Both of them. Gone. He looked at the picture with something approaching the grief Naomi had felt when Mercy was taken. I was going to name him Solomon after your husband. Did you know that? I admired him. The way he could read, write, think. I was jealous of his mind, so I had my father hang him. And now you've killed me, and Sarah's waiting on the other side, and what do I tell her? What do I tell her about who I became? The confession broke something in him, and his final convulsions were almost merciful, ending his philosophical torment if not his physical agony. He died clutching the daguerreotype, his last word, Sarah, bubbling through lips flecked with foam and blood. Reverend Mordecai Pike's death became a sermon in reverse, his body preaching truths his mouth had never spoken. The poison seemed to attack his vanity first, his carefully maintained appearance dissolving into something primitive and raw. His pomaded hair fell limp with sweat. His round face collapsed into hollows and shadows. His pristine collar became a noose of soiled fabric. But it was his voice that suffered most. That golden instrument he'd used to justify atrocity with scripture now reduced to animal sounds that belonged in no church. Yet in his delirium, he began to quote scripture accurately for perhaps the first time in his life, the verses coming out garbled but recognizable. Thou shalt not steal. And hadn't slavery been the ultimate theft? Thou shalt not kill. And how many had died under his blessing? Thou shalt not bear false witness. And his entire theology had been false witness against God's actual words. The Bible he'd dropped lay open beside him, pages fluttering in the wind from the open window, stopping at James. Faith without works is dead. His faith had been all words, no works of mercy, and now both faith and flesh were dying together. See them, Pike gasped, his eyes fixed on the ceiling but seeing something beyond. All of them. Everyone I sent to the auction block after preaching submission. They're waiting for me. Oh God, they're waiting for me, and there's no forgiveness in their eyes, just the truth. Just terrible, terrible truth. Ezekiel Harrow, the breaker of men, was breaking still, but now it was his own body rebelling against him, his own strength turned traitor. His muscles, developed through decades of physical dominance, now spasmed with such force that his bones cracked audibly, the sound like branches snapping in a storm. He who had perfected the science of breaking others without quite killing them, now experienced that exact calibration of suffering, the poison keeping him conscious enough to feel everything, while denying him the mercy of shock or unconsciousness. Please, he begged, this man who'd never responded to begging, never shown mercy no matter how desperately it was requested. Please make it stop, I'll free them all. I'll sign the papers. Every last one. Just make it stop. It's too late for bargaining, old Samuel said from the doorway, his voice carrying the weight of ancient judgment. You can't negotiate with death any more than we could negotiate with you. It comes when it comes, takes what it takes, and all your pleading just makes the silence after louder. Prudence Ashford's body had gone still, but her eyes remained open, moving, tracking the movement of people she'd considered property, watching them watch her die. Her mouth worked soundlessly, trying to form words, curses probably, or commands, but her severed control over her own flesh was absolute. She who had cut out tongues to silence others was now silenced herself, reduced to communication through eyes that blazed with helpless fury. Naomi knelt beside her, close enough that only Prudence could hear her whisper, "That woman whose tongue you cut out. Her name was Esther. She had 5 children. After you maimed her, she couldn't tell them she loved them anymore, couldn't sing them to sleep, couldn't even scream when you sold them one by one. She killed herself 3 months ago, drowned in the river because she couldn't live with the silence you forced on her. Can you feel it now, Prudence? That silence closing in? That's Esther's gift to you. That's her justice." Prudence's eyes widened, pupils dilating with more than just the poison's effect, and for a moment, just a moment, Naomi saw something that might have been understanding, or might have been the random firing of dying neurons. Then those ancient eyes fixed, staring at nothing, everything, the great beyond that made no distinction between mistress and slave. Judge Cornelius Bellwether was crawling again, but not toward escape or help. He crawled toward his study, toward the safe where he kept his important papers, and Naomi understood with cold clarity what he was trying to do. Even dying, even with foam pouring from his mouth and his body failing in segments like a building collapsing floor by floor, he was trying to reach the bills of sale, the ownership papers, the documents that defined his wealth in human terms. Whether to destroy them or preserve them, she couldn't tell and didn't care. She followed him, watching his progress with the detached interest of someone observing an insect's final moments. His expensive clothes were ruined, soaked with brandy, sweat, blood, and worse things. His hands, which had signed so many documents condemning people to suffering, now barely functioned, fingers spasming uselessly against the Persian rug that had cost 3 human lives to purchase. "The papers," he gasped, "must protect legacy." "Your legacy dies with you," Naomi informed him. "Your son is dead. Your line has ended. Your name will become a cautionary tale whispered in slave quarters across the South. The only thing you'll be remembered for is dying like this, poisoned by a woman you never thought to fear because you never thought of her as human enough to be dangerous." He made it to the study door before his body finally refused any further commands. He lay there, half in the parlor, half in the hallway, suspended between rooms like he was suspended between life and death. His breathing had become a rattling wheeze, each inhalation a mountain to climb, each exhalation a valley of despair, but his eyes remained conscious, aware, processing the impossibility of his position. Judge Cornelius Bellwether, one of the richest men in Kentucky, dying on his own floor while his property watched. "I tried to be fair," he whispered, though, to whom, Naomi, God himself, was unclear. "I never whipped without cause. I kept families together when profitable. I let them have Christmas and Easter off. I was a good master." "There is no such thing as a good master," Naomi replied. "That's like saying you were a kind kidnapper, a gentle rapist, a merciful murderer. The very concept is corrupt. You built your heaven on our hell and called it righteousness. You dressed evil in fine clothes and called it civilization. You turned children into currency and called it economics. There is no good version of that, Judge. There never was." More enslaved people had gathered now, filling the doorway, lining the halls, drawn by the impossible scene of masters dying while they lived. Some were crying, not from grief, but from the overwhelming reality of witnessing the impossible. Others stood silent, processing a world where such things could happen. A few were already backing away, understanding that this moment of triumph would be followed by terrible retribution from the white world that would never let such an action stand. But for now, in this moment, they watched Judge Cornelius Bellwether die by inches, watched the power drain from him like water from a broken cup, watched him transform from master to meat, from oppressor to object lesson, from man who owned others to man who couldn't even own his own failing flesh. He tried to speak again, but only blood came out, bright and arterial, painting his lips, the color of the wine he'd toasted with earlier. His body convulsed once more, a final surge of electrical activity in a system shutting down, and then he was still except for the barely perceptible rise and fall of his chest. Not dead yet, but dying, suspended in that liminal space where all pretense falls away and only truth remains. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, though it was nowhere near that time, its mechanism disturbed by the chaos or perhaps marking some other kind of time, the end of one world and the beginning of another, however briefly it might last. The sound echoed through the mansion, through rooms built by enslaved hands, decorated with wealth extracted from enslaved bodies, maintained by enslaved labor, and now transformed into a tomb for those who'd thought themselves masters of everything, including death itself. Dawn broke over Bourbon County like a bloodshot eye-opening, the sun painting the Bellwether mansion in shades of crimson and gold that seemed to mock the horror within, where 8 bodies lay scattered across the parlor floor like broken dolls, their faces frozen in final expressions of agony and disbelief, foam dried to crust on blue lips, eyes staring at nothing, or perhaps at everything they'd never bothered to see in life. Naomi sat in Judge Cornelius Bellwether's chair at the head of the dining table, her hands folded in her lap, with the same composure she'd maintained while serving their final meal, watching through the tall windows as the world continued its indifferent rotation, as if 8 masters hadn't just been erased from existence, as if the impossible hadn't just become history. The mansion was quiet now, eerily so, the kind of silence that follows screaming, that fills spaces where suffering has exhausted itself. The grandfather clock, which had chimed midnight at the wrong hour, now hung silent, its mechanism finally broken, marking the exact moment when time had stopped for the Bellwether dynasty and all their guests. The portraits on the walls seemed different in this new light, less imposing, more pathetic, dead men painted in oils that would outlast their flesh but not their power, not their relevance, not their world. Delilah found her mother there as the first rays of true sunlight pierced the dining room, illuminating the empty plates, the crystal glasses still holding dregs of wine, the white tablecloth spotted with gravy that looked like old blood in the morning light. The girl moved carefully, as if the floor might give way beneath her, as if this new world where masters could die and slaves could live was too fragile to trust with her full weight. Her young face carried an expression too complex for her 16 years, horror mixed with relief, fear tangled with something that might have been hope if hope weren't so dangerous. "Mama," she whispered, the word carrying questions too large for language. "Mama, what have you done?" Naomi turned to her daughter, her face calm as a portrait, though her eyes held depths that had never been there before, or perhaps had always been there but hidden beneath the mask of servitude she'd worn for 4 decades. "I've ended something," she said simply, "and started something else. Though what that something else will be, I won't live to see." "They're all dead," Delilah said, as if saying it might make it real, might cement this impossibility into fact. "All 8 of them, dead." "Yes." Naomi reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded paper, edges charred from where she'd held it over a candle flame. "This was your bill of sale. Judge Bellwether had already signed it. You were to be sent to Louisiana next week, sold to a man known for working young women to death in his sugar fields. The money was already paid." She let the burned paper fall to the table where it crumbled into ash. "Now you're free. Not legally, not officially, but actually. Run north, child. Run and don't stop until you reach Canada." "What about you?" Delilah's voice cracked, becoming the child she still was beneath, the premature adulthood slavery forced upon its victims. "I'm staying. Someone has to be here when they come. Someone has to tell the story correctly, even if they won't believe it, won't record it, won't remember it the way it actually happened. But you'll remember, won't you? You'll tell your children, and they'll tell theirs, and somewhere down the long river of time, the truth of this Easter will survive." Old Samuel appeared in the doorway, his ancient face showing neither surprise nor judgment, just the deep weariness of someone who'd seen too much for too long. "The field hands have run," he reported. Most of the house slaves, too. Word spreading faster than fire. Every plantation in the county will know by noon. They'll come with dogs and guns and ropes. I know, Naomi said. Let them come. You could run too, Samuel suggested, though his tone indicated he knew better. Might make it to the river before they organize. No, someone has to be the period at the end of this sentence. Someone has to stand in the light and say, I did this, so they know it wasn't random, wasn't an accident, wasn't anything but deliberate justice delivered by deliberate hands. She stood, smoothing her apron with the same care she'd always shown, maintaining dignity in a world designed to strip it away. Besides, where would I run to? Mercy is gone. Solomon is gone. Everything I was is gone. All that's left is what I've done, and I won't run from that. From outside came the sound of horses, many horses, their hoofbeats like thunder rolling across the hills of Kentucky. The sun climbed higher, indifferent to human drama, warming the earth that had absorbed so much blood it had forgotten the taste of plain water. Birds sang in the trees, ignorant of the change in management below. The world continued its ancient patterns while inside the Bellwether mansion, everything had changed, and nothing had changed, and both were true at once. Delilah was crying now, tears rolling down her cheeks like rain on window glass. Mama, please, please run, please try. I did try, Naomi said, pulling her daughter close, holding her the way she'd held Mercy the night before they took her. This was my try. This was my attempt at justice in an unjust world. And it worked, didn't it? 8 men who thought themselves gods learned they were just men. 8 families who built fortunes on our backs learned those fortunes could crumble in the time it takes to digest a meal. That's not nothing, child. That's everything. The horses were closer now, and with them came voices, angry voices, white, voices full of rage and disbelief and the particular fury of those who'd just discovered their own vulnerability. Someone was shouting about hanging, about making examples, about teaching lessons that would last generations. They always talked about teaching lessons, Naomi thought, but never about learning them. Go, she told Delilah, pushing her toward the back door. Go now while they're focused on the front. Samuel, take her. Take whoever else is left. Head north and don't look back. What about you being the period at the end of the sentence? Samuel asked. They'll find my body. That'll be period enough. My body and theirs, locked together in this house forever, master and slave made equal by death, both reduced to meat and memory. If that's not an ending, I don't know what is. Samuel nodded, understanding in his ancient eyes. He took Delilah's hand, had to pull her away from her mother, the girl screaming now, begging, but there was no time for proper goodbyes. There never had been, not in this system that treated partings like punctuation, common and unremarkable. They disappeared through the back door just as the front door exploded inward, kicked open by boots that had kicked open so many doors, looking for escaped property, looking for hidden rebellion, looking for anything that threatened the order they'd built on disorder. Sheriff William Garrett of Bourbon County entered first, his face red with exertion and rage, followed by a dozen men armed with rifles, pistols, ropes already knotted into nooses. They stopped when they saw the bodies, 8 corpses arranged by death's democracy across the parlor floor. And for a moment, just a moment, fear flickered across their faces. Then they saw Naomi, standing calm in the dining room, and their fear transformed into rage because rage was safer, rage was familiar. Rage didn't require them to reconsider their entire world. You, Garrett said, the word containing volumes of accusation. Me, Naomi confirmed, her voice steady as stone. You poisoned them, all of them. I seasoned their lamb with herbs they'd never tasted before. If they chose to eat it, that was their choice. Free will, Sheriff. Surely you believe in that. Garrett raised his pistol, pointing it at her head, his hand shaking with fury. You'll hang for this, but first, you'll tell us who helped you. Who else was involved? No one. I acted alone. I gathered the plants alone. I prepared the meal alone. I served it alone. I watched them die alone. This was my action, my choice, My justice. Justice? Garrett spat the word like poison, ironic, given the circumstances. You call this justice? I call it what it is, the inevitable result of pushing human beings past the point of human endurance. You can hang me, Sheriff, but you can't hang the knowledge that this happened, that it was possible, that one woman with nothing but grief and botanical knowledge could bring down 8 of the finest families in Kentucky. That knowledge will spread like seeds on the wind. Every meal you eat from now on, you'll wonder. Every slave who serves you, you'll suspect. Every mysterious illness, every unexpected death, you'll question. I've poisoned more than 8 men, Sheriff. I've poisoned your peace of mind forever. One of the men with Garrett, younger, nervous, whispered. She's right. If one could do this, others could too. We'll never be safe. Shut up, Garrett snarled. But the seed was planted, the thought spoken, the fear given form. From outside came more sounds, dogs barking, more horses arriving, the whole machinery of white authority mobilizing to respond to this impossibility. They would hang Naomi, certainly, probably from the same tree where Solomon had died, turning the instrument of one tragedy into the instrument of another, as if repetition could restore their world to its previous shape. But shapes once changed could never fully return to their original form. Every sculptor knew that. Every potter, every artist who worked with materials that remembered their transformations. The others, Garrett demanded. The other slaves. Where are they? Gone, Naomi said simply. Scattered like dandelion seeds. You'll catch some, maybe most, but not all. And the ones you don't catch will carry stories. They'll tell others what happened here. They'll share the recipe, perhaps not for poison, but for possibility, for the radical notion that masters can die just as easily as slaves. That power is temporary, that even the mightiest house can fall if its foundation is rotten enough. Garrett struck her then, his pistol catching her across the face, opening, a cut that bled freely down her cheek. She didn't flinch, didn't cry out, just touched the blood with curious fingers, as if wondering at its color, its warmth, its similarity to the blood that had poured from the masters' mouths as they died. Take her, Garrett ordered his men. We'll have a proper trial, make a proper example. The whole county will watch her hang. As they bound her hands, Naomi looked one last time at the dining room, at the table where death had been served with careful hands and careful planning. The morning sun was fully up now, streaming through the windows, illuminating the scene with theatrical perfection. The empty plates gleamed like accusations. The vacant chairs stood like gallows. The whole room was a monument to a moment when the impossible became possible, when the last became first, when a mother's grief transformed into something harder than iron, sharper than any blade. They dragged her from the house, past the bodies of the men who'd thought themselves immortal, invincible, invaluable. But bodies were just bodies in the end, whether they'd worn silk or cotton, whether they'd commanded or obeyed, whether they'd died in beds or fields or parlors poisoned by perfect justice. The great equalizer had visited the Bellwether Plantation, and its name was not Death but Naomi, a woman whose name meant pleasant in Hebrew, though there had been nothing pleasant about her life until this final terrible triumph. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Kentucky, over fields that would go unworked today, over quarters that stood empty, over a world that had shifted slightly on its axis, though most wouldn't notice, wouldn't acknowledge, wouldn't admit that change was not only possible but inevitable, that every system built on suffering contained the seeds of its own destruction, needed only the right gardener to tend them, water them with tears, fertilize them with rage, and harvest them when the season of suffering became unbearable. As they lifted Naomi onto a horse, hands still bound, face still bleeding, she saw a mockingbird land on the fence post near the garden where the nightshade still grew, where the hemlock flourished, where the oleander bloomed beautiful and deadly in the morning sun. The bird sang, its voice containing multitudes, every song it had ever heard, including, perhaps, the hymns enslaved people sang in the fields, songs of deliverance, songs of justice, songs of a freedom that might not come in this life but would, must come. was coming even now in forms both terrible and necessary. The procession moved away from the Bellwether mansion, leaving it to stand as a tomb, a monument, a warning that would be interpreted differently depending on who was doing the interpreting. Some would see it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of treating property too kindly, of allowing slaves too much access, too much trust. Others would see it as proof that rebellion was possible, that the master's house could be brought down from within, that sometimes the cook held more power than the king if she knew the right recipes. Naomi rode toward her certain death with her head high, her back straight, her eyes clear. She had no regrets. She had saved Delilah from Louisiana's sugar fields. She had ended 8 lines of cruelty. She had written her name in history with poison and patience, and if history would not record it accurately, well, that was history's failing, not hers. The truth would survive in whispers, in warnings, in the careful cultivation of certain plants in certain gardens by certain women who understood that sometimes justice required seasoning a meal with more than salt. Behind them, the Bellwether mansion stood silent in the morning light, 8 bodies cooling in its parlor, their last meal still being digested by systems that had shut down, the poison completing its work even in death, ensuring that even their corpses would be tainted, unfit for the earth that had already swallowed too much poison, too much pain, too much of everything except justice, which had finally, briefly, terribly been served. The sun rose fully over Bourbon County, Kentucky, on this Easter Monday, 1848, Resurrection Day become Reckoning Day, and somewhere, perhaps, Mercy was waking to another day of bondage in Mississippi, not knowing her mother had just traded her life for the possibility, however slim, that such bondage might not last forever, that the master's house built on sand and blood and bones could fall, had fallen, would fall again, until someday, somehow, somewhere, the falling would stop because there would be nothing left to fall, only free people standing in the ruins, remembering. Thanks for watching this chilling story. Subscribe for more dark historical tales and let us know in the comments which historical horror story you'd like to see next.